Some people are already calling this World War III. Iran, Israel, oil prices moving, markets reacting. And if you're planning to retire abroad, or you've already have, there is a question sitting at the back of your mind. What does this actually mean for me and my money? But if we're honest, you ask it every single time something like this happens in the world. It is not unique to what is currently happening. So in this video, I'm not just going to talk about Iran. I'm going to answer the question properly for this conflict and for everyone that comes after it, because the answer, as it turns out, is almost always the same. And once you understand that, you will never watch a war, or for that matter, a negative headline, the same way again. We're going to cover three things. So number one, what this conflict actually means for you specifically as someone living abroad, because it is not what most people think. Number two, what history tells us about wars and your money and why that should change how you feel right now. And number three, most importantly, exactly what to check and do about it. So let's get straight into it. Part one, what this actually means if you live abroad. Most of the financial commentary you're seeing right now is written for people who are not living abroad. If you've built a life in another country, you have three exposures that simply do not apply in the same way to someone who hasn't. And this conflict is putting pressure on all three of them. The first one is, of course, cost of living. Conflict typically affects the cost of living everywhere. That's not unique to retiring abroad either. Someone sitting at home feels it too when energy prices spike or food costs start to rise. But when you're living abroad, it can land differently. And here's why. Every country has its own structure. And when a global conflict hits, it does not hit every country the same way. A conflict that spikes oil prices, like we're seeing now with the Strait of Hormuz carrying roughly 20% of the world's oil supply, will hit a country that relies on its energy from another country far harder than one with its own domestic supply. And if you happen to have retired somewhere with high energy dependency, your cost of living can increase fast as a result, even if your portfolio does not match this increase. That gap between what your money says it's worth and what it actually buys you is really worth paying attention to and making sure that you stay on top of. The second exposure is currency. When conflict escalates, investors tend to move to safety. Historically, that means certain currencies strengthen, particularly the US dollar, while others weaken. So if your pension or income comes in one currency and your life costs are in another, say your income's in pounds but your expenses are in euros, your portfolio number looks exactly the same, but your purchasing power can change dramatically. This has happened in every major conflict in modern history. The third exposure is not financial. It is emotional, and in many ways, it's the most dangerous one. When the headlines are this loud, the instinct is to do something, move money, sell down, restructure, go to safety. That feeling is completely natural. And if you're living abroad, there is something else on top of all of this. The people you love back home are watching the same headlines and they are going to be worried about you. And that's real pressure, and it just sits on top of everything else. That combination of financial anxiety and emotional pressure is exactly the environment in which people make horrendous decisions that they later regret. Which is why the next thing we're going to look at matters so much, because history is very clear about what wars actually do to long-term financial plans, and it's probably not what the headlines are telling you. So part two, what history actually tells us. Every major conflict in modern history has triggered the same reaction in financial markets. Prices drop, volatility spikes, the headlines get louder and louder. And the feeling in your stomach is that this time is different starts to get stronger and stronger. But here is what the data actually shows. If we look back at the Korean War, markets fell sharply when it broke out, then they recovered, then they kept going up. The Cuban Missile Crisis, 13 days where the world genuinely thought nuclear Armageddon was coming. Markets dropped, then recovered, then kept going up. September the 11th, one of the most shocking single events in modern memory. Markets closed for a week. When they reopened, they fell hard. And within a month, they'd recovered most of it. Within a year, they were higher than they'd had been before. This pattern is not a coincidence. It is what markets have done historically through every major conflict, every geopolitical shock, and every moment that felt like the world was ending. The investors who got hurt during these moments were not the ones who stayed the course. They were the ones who saw the drop, felt the fear, made a decision, and then watched the recovery happen without them. That is not bad luck. That is what happens when emotion drives a financial decision. And as we just covered, retiring abroad gives you more emotional pressure than you would typically have retiring at home, not less. Which makes this even more important to understand. History does not guarantee anything about the future, but it does tell us something consistently. The noise of a conflict and the long-term direction of a well-built financial plan have historically had very little to do with each other. Which brings us to the part that actually matters. And it's not the history and it's not the theory. It is what you should specifically be thinking about as someone who has built a life abroad. Part 3, what should we actually be thinking about? So we've covered what's happening and why it feels the way it does. And we've seen what history tells us about how these moments tend to play out. Now the practical part. And the first thing to say is that for most people who have a well-structured plan, the list of things that genuinely need to change is far shorter than you think. But there are a few things worth looking at. The first is your cost of living. Understand the cost structure of the country you're living in. Every country is exposed to global instability differently. Know which parts of your monthly spending are vulnerable to that and which are not. The second is your currency exposure. Know what currency your income comes in and what currency your life actually costs you in. And know what happens to your purchasing power if these two start to move against each other. The third is your cash buffer. If you have enough cash set aside to cover your living costs for a meaningful period of time, you never have to sell anything at a bad moment. Markets can move, headlines can be terrifying, and you can sit with all of it calmly because your day-to-day life does not depend on what happens next. These are not complicated things, but they are worth getting right. This is not really about Iran or Ukraine or whatever conflict is going to dominate the headlines next when you watch this. It's about the fact that the world will always find a new reason to feel uncertain. The people who retire abroad successfully are not the ones who predicted every crisis. They are the ones who planned properly and built something sturdy enough that it did not matter. If this video has raised questions about your own situation, the link in the description will connect you with a regulated planner who can help you answer questions that are specific to you. Thanks for watching and see you in the next video.